So I am going to start. I think we were in the middle of my notes on chapter 10. So I think we should start there. We were talking about bracha achrona, the brachos that we make after we eat. And so if I'm not mistaken, we are up to the let me see where far. Maybe I guess we can start from the beginning of that chapter. So because some of it might be a review of what we did last time, but we'll do it this way so that we don't miss out on what we did. So we already had a lot of discussion a while back on the halachos of benching, right, of brichat hamazon, which we say after a meal. But now we're going to talk more about the other types of brachot that we do after we eat. So if it's a rabbinic decree, and if you remember, we learned the rule of kol detikun rabbanon kein d'oraita tikun, that anytime the rabbis made a decree, they fashioned it after something we find in the Torah directly. So just like the Torah said that Yachalta v'savata u'veirachta, which was the verse from which we derived the law, that when you eat a meal, which is defined halachically as a meal with bread, that you're supposed to bench, you're supposed to say brichat hamazon. So they said anytime you eat, we should also make a blessing that and you have the pleasure of having eaten, you have that feeling of having eaten. If you eat and you feel satisfied, you should make a blessing. So they wanted to do that even when you don't have an actual obligation to bench. So the first thing is the halacha is dependent upon the feeling of satisfaction. So there is no official time limit behind that. So if you still feel satisfied, if you still feel good that you ate, then it's still within the time limit that you're allowed to make the bracha. So the first type that we'll talk about is the bracha me'ein shalosh, which is the blessing that summarizes benching. Remember, we mentioned the three requirements for benching, which are included in the first three brachot of benching. So the bracha me'ein shalosh summarizes those three ideas. And this bracha was designed after the Chachamim. Since the Chachamim made this gezerah, they made this decree. So they said that it should be done anytime you eat of any of the 7 fruits of the Beit HaMikdash. 7 fruit with which Israel is blessed. So the idea that I just said, that this is a D'Rabbanan as opposed to a D'Oraita, is itself a machloket, a Rishonim. In general, the halacha follows what I just told you, which is why I said it first. But there are Rishonim that understand that actually the Chachamim, when they made their decree, it wasn't a decree that they made and fashioned it after what the pasuk says, what the verse said, but rather they made it and derived it from the pasuk. In other words, it's actually a mitzvah d'oraita, and it's something that it's a Torah origin, and the Torah then would command us that under some circumstances you have to say a full birchat hamazon, and under some circumstances you make an abbreviated one. And I quoted that from the Rosh and the Rasha. So although the general halacha follows the opinion that I stated in the beginning, there are those that have an opinion that even this is a mitzvah d'oraita. So this would have a lot of significant consequences. The most obvious one would be is if you're in doubt as to whether or not you said the blessing. Is it a sefeka d'oraita? Is it something min haTorah that therefore you should be stringent and say the blessing, or is it a d'Rabbanan and you should be lenient and not say the blessing? Because the blessing was designed after the 7 fruits, there's several different types of fruit that you can have, right? the fruits include grains, right? Chitos, or wheat and barley are grains, which are mizonot. Yes. Okay. Do you want to say something? Okay, so the fruit could be grains, right? They can also be fruits like figs and pomegranates and dates, right? And they can also be wine, geffen, right? So all of those. So when the Chachamim were mitaken, when they set the text of the bracha me'ein shalosh, there are three potential endings. There's ala micha v'al hakalkala, which means on the food that michya, which sustains, which in Chazal's mind always meant a grain, right? There's al ha'etz v'al pri ha'etz, right, which is the on trees and the fruits of trees, and al hagefen v'al pri hagefen, which is on wine and the fruits of the vine. So it could be any of those three. So that would be that would be the beginning of the blessing, one of those three beginnings. In the end, it could be al haaretz v'al hapero. We thank God for the land and for the fruit. Al haaretz v'al hagefen. Thank God for the land and for the wine. Al haaretz v'al michya. We thank God for the land and for the michya and the foods which sustain us, depending on what you ate. There is a slight difference in geography too. If you're eating the fruits of the land of Israel, so then you say, al haaretz v'al peroteha, on the land and on her fruit, as opposed to just on the land and on fruit in general. Or al haaretz v'al pri gafna, if you're drinking an Israeli wine, you should say on the haaretz and on the fruit of her wine, the wine that is grown within her, within that land. There's also if it's said on Shabbos or Yom Tov, then you make an addition, say a short addition for Shabbos or for Yom Tov. If you look in the Siddur, it says the small sentence addition that you add for each one of those. So this is the basis of the bracha me'ein shalosh, of the summary blessing, which we make on those seven. On the seven items that we mentioned before, the seven fruits of Eretz Yisrael. If you eat a fruit that is not one of the seven species, let's say you have an apple and a pomegranate, and or you have a glass of wine and a glass of orange juice, right? So the glass of wine you're supposed to make an ala gefen, and on the orange juice you're supposed to make a borei nefashot, which we're about to talk about in a minute. So the din is that you can make just the al hagefen, just like the bracha rishona, the wine goes on the other drinks. So the al hagefen for the wine can cover the other drinks, and you don't have to say a borei nefashot. Same thing would go for the fruits. That if you had a pomegranate and an apple, and you say al ha'etz, you make a al ha'etz, then that would pater the apple too. You don't have to make a separate borei nefashot on the apple. So the bracha me'ein shalosh is inclusive of things that also need a borei nefashot if you ate them together. So typically, if you sit down and you have you have a meal of mizonot, even though mixed in with the mizonot, you probably have some other things, some shahakol, some hadama, whatever. Just an ala michya is enough to cover the whole, everything you had. Unless it was drink, in which case the borei nefashot, you have to make a separate borei nefashot for it, because drink is separate. So we had several sessions we had about birchat hamazon. So we'll have to leave that, because we've done that in a lot. We just discussed the bracha me'ein shalosh, the summary, and now there's the really short version for things that are not of the seven species, and that's the borei nefashot. That's the shortest version of the bracha achrona, and this everyone agrees is a derabanan, is not derived from the pasuk, and you make a borei nefashot if you had any other food. So that includes drinks, foods, whatever, whatever you have. If it doesn't include one of the seven species, and it's not a mizonot, then you make a borei nefashot. That's what you're supposed to say. There is a question as to whether or not, if you, let's say, had a mizonot, let's say I had a piece of I'm sorry. Let's say you had a meal, right? You had a meal, and you're supposed to say Birchat Hamazon. You had bread and everything, and then instead you said Ala Michya. Instead, you said the summary blessing. So there's a whole lot of opinions as to whether or not you were Yotze B'di'evet and you should bench again. I'm not going to go into all the different opinions, but the general idea is whether or not this fulfilled the three basic things that you need to fulfill in benching. So in general, we paskin, that most modern paskin that you should go back and bench, because the alamichya only fulfills the rabbinic requirement. It doesn't fulfill the Torah requirement for benching. So that's the general psak, but it's a subject of a lot of debate. So I wanted to just mention that debate, but without going into all the details. Let's see, a couple things. The Bori Nefashot and the Alamichya, and the Bracha Mein Shalosh require eating the size of an olive, food the size of a zayit, of an olive. Because that's what the Chachamim considered to be considered eating. If you have something the size of an olive, it's a tiny amount, a small amount, but that's enough, large enough that that's considered that you've eaten. There's a huge amount of debate, especially in the last, maybe 20, 40 years or so, about what the size of an olive is. What is a kazayit? So there is. I'm gonna go out on a limb here, and I'll say you can look it up. You can follow whichever authority you personally would like to follow on to what the size of this kazayit is. But there's a lot of poskim, and there's enough place to, and it's almost certain that until approximately 50 years ago, this was the custom among Jews worldwide, is that you look at the piece that you're eating, and if it appears to be approximately the size of an olive, that is what an olive is. So that's where I'm going to end my discussion as to what the size of an olive is. People know, we're familiar with what an olive is, and approximately that size, that's considered eating. You see in some of the poskim that it would be about half the size of an egg, but I don't think that would have to be a really big olive and a really small egg. But there's some things that are important, that it goes by volume, not by weight. So if it's the size of an olive, even if it's something that is very light and fluffy, that's still considered a kazayit. If it's smaller than an olive, even if it's heavy and dense, that's not a kazayit. So it goes by volume. So the bottom line is you actually look at it. If it appears to be the size of an olive, that's a kazayit. And that's if you eat a kazayit over a long period of time, you take little nibbles of crumb, every 15 minutes for 2 hours, does that count as eating a whole kazayit? So the idea is that no, it has to be eaten within kedei achilat pras, which means the amount of time it would take to eat a pras, which literally means an average size piece of bread. So what is and there's a lot of different opinions on this, but usually most of them, depending on how you calculate it, by using all kinds of proof texts, but somewhere in between 6 and 9 minutes. So again, use your judgment. If you ate something the size of an olive within a little bit more than 9 minutes, then somewhere between 7, 8 minutes or so, then you've eaten enough, and you're obligated to make a bracha achrona. There is an opinion that says that there's an opinion that says that anything that's a beria, anything that's a whole thing, such as, for example, a berry. Let's say you ate a blueberry. So a blueberry is for sure smaller than an olive, right? But if you ate a blueberry, that's an entire blueberry. It's an entire creation, right? So some say that would be considered enough to be mechayev a bracha achrona, simply because of its chashivut, because it's special, because it's an entire beria. We find this concept in a lot of places in halacha, which one day we'll get to, the concept of a beria which it will actually, we may discuss it a little bit when we talk later tonight about Iker and Tafel, about the main versus the primary versus the secondary things in a mixture. But a beria, a whole thing can't become batel. It can't, meaning it can't become nullified in a bigger mixture because it's too special. It doesn't get nullified. So some say the same thing would apply here. If you have a blueberry, even though it's not the size of an olive, so that's the argument back and forth. I'm not going to come down on any particular side of that argument, but right now. But that's another debate that you find in the poskim as to whether or not the easy answer is just eat another 2 blueberries and you're good to go, and you make a blessing and you're fine. Now so what about if we said you need to have a kizayat? Let's say you have a cookie, and the cookie itself is the size of it's a small cookie. The cookie itself is the size of an olive, but you're being smart about this. You're thinking, wait a minute, the mizonot that obligates me to make the blessing of alamichya, the bracha mein shalosh, is only a portion of it. There's also sugar in there. There's eggs in there. Who knows, depending on what kind of cookie, there might be raisins in there, chocolate chips in there, peanut butter, who knows, whatever you threw into that cookie, right? So did you eat a kizayat of mizonot? So this is a good this is going to be a good segue case into our next discussion of Iker and Tafel also. But so the question is, if it's visible, when you look at the cookie, you see here's a cookie and there's a big chunk of chocolate, then the chocolate doesn't count towards the mizonah, right? However, if it's not visible, if you look at it, it looks like a cookie, but you happen to know that there's chocolate flavor and I don't know, whatever other flavors, eggs, whatever others mixed in there, then it's considered batel to the flour, and it does add to the shear of a kizayat. So now if you take an olive-sized cookie, you know how to calculate whether or not you're supposed to make a bracha mein shalosh on that. There's another issue I wanted to talk about a little before we finish this subject, and that is the issue of wine. Remember, I'm touching on a lot of famous machlokot, a lot of famous disagreements that there are on the subject, without resolving some of these disagreements. I'm leaving that up to you in many cases. But I just want you to be aware of what the discussions are, and if the topic of particular interests you, tell me about it, and you can either present what the machloket next time, or you can at least just look into it for yourself if you find it to be interesting. And if you want more sources, then please just text me offline, and I'll be happy to give them to you. The issue about wine, is not a liquid has a different shear than an olive. A liquid has a different amount, and that amount is a revi'at. A revi'at is a measurement that roughly equals the 75 cc milliliters in today's measurements. I think that's something like 3.2 something or 3.3 ounces, something like that. Others say that even liquid has the same shear as solid, and it goes by volume, and the same volume that goes by solid, which is an olive. So that's another disagreement. Another, which I mentioned in my notes, is between Rambam and others. We generally poskin in this case that it goes by a revi'as, not by a kizayas. But Tosfos hold that it's a kizayas. What about the timing? So some say it's the same. Some say that the shear of kedei achilas pras, of eating a piece of bread, is specific to eating, right? But it's not relevant to drinking. Drinking, it depends on the average time it takes to drink that much wine. So that's another argument. Some say, and this is very relevant today, and not just today, if you say that drinking has its own shear, what about when you drink something that's hot? When you drink a hot coffee or a hot tea? And many poskim, and I tend to do this myself in my own practice, although you can choose for yourself what makes sense to you, and that is that when it comes to hot tea or hot coffee, because this particular type of drink generally is normal to take a longer amount of time, right? You sip tea, it takes you, I don't know, whatever, 10, 15 minutes to drink a cup of tea. So therefore, as long as you drank the tea within what's a normal amount of time for a hot cup of tea, you have to make a borei nefashot. You have to make a blessing afterwards, as opposed to using the kshir k'dei achilas process, just 6 to 9 minutes. So I think that's a reasonable approach, and certainly many poskim hold that way. But others say that no, there's no differentiation in Chazal between a hot drink and a cold drink. So therefore, the shear remains the same shear. So they'll tell you, drink a bunch of water afterwards or before, just to make sure you covered it, and then make your blessing afterwards. I mentioned already before that there is no specific amount of time after you finish eating or drinking to make the blessing, as long as you still feel, full. You're still, or if it was a drink, you don't feel thirsty. You still don't feel thirsty. You don't feel hungry. So that's your time zone. So there have been times given, such as 30-minute times, 72-minute times, but those were given as averages for how long it takes until you feel hungry or thirsty again. But if you happen to still feel full after 72 minutes, then you could still make the blessing. So it's a judgment call that you need to make. The one last point I wanted to make before we went on to Iker and Tafel is the question here of if you're somebody's got to mute their I don't know, but I think somebody has to mute their sound. Okay, that's better.
I think it's Jeff.
Okay. Jeff. All right. The last thing here is the issue of if you're sitting down at like an affair and they serve one food, and then there's a speech, and then they dance, and then there's a movie, and then there's a video, and then you go outside for a walk, and then you come back and you eat again. Whether you should make a bracha rishona and then make a blessing afterwards, and then later when you eat again, you make another blessing before and another blessing afterwards. We kind of sort of had this discussion before when we talked about a meal when you wash on challah beforehand. And the general rule of thumb for practical purposes is, if you see this entire thing as one event, and each serving of food is part of this one event that you came to, it's best to make one blessing in the beginning, do all the eating in the middle. If you have to make another blessing because first you made a sha'akol and now they bring some fruits, so you make a eighth, and then later they bring some vegetables, so that's fine. But generally, one bracha in the beginning and one bracha in the end is considered the appropriate way, and not to make what's called a bracha she'eina tzricha. We're going to go in about, I think probably in another 2-3 weeks, I'm going to get to certain rules about brachot, many of which we've touched upon, but we're going to review things like a bracha she'eina tzricha, like not making a blessing that's unnecessary, bracha levatala, a blessing that's for nothing. We're going to go through a whole bunch of different rules about brachot, and it'll almost be a review of everything we learned. But before I go on to the next subject, which is Iker and Tafel, which I was really looking forward to doing, but I don't know if we'll be able to complete it tonight, because I managed to write up what I consider Saul's algorithm for figuring out what bracha to make when you have a mishka bobble of foods in front of you. But I don't know if we'll get there tonight. But before we move on, any questions about the about bracha me'in shalosh, which is otherwise known as the alamichya or the borei nefashos? Any questions, any comments, anything anyone want to say? If there isn't, then I'm going to go on to the next subject. The next subject is the subject of Iker and Tafel. Now, what is Iker and Tafel? So Iker and Tafel is, give me 1 second, I'm just pulling up my notes so I have them right in front of me. Hold on, I'm sorry, it's my computer's acting up a little. Almost there. Okay, so what is ikar and tafel? So ikar, the word ikar means the main thing, right? Tafel means the opposite of the main thing. I don't know, the minor thing. So ikar refers to what's the primary ingredient, and tafel refers to what is the secondary ingredient in this thing that you're about to eat. So the Gemara in Brachos, and I says very clearly the following rule, which is one of those cases where the rule sounds so easy, but then when you try to apply the rule, you can twist your brain in 17 different directions to figure out how you actually apply it. And the rule is as follows. If you have an ikar and a tafel, meaning you have in front of you the main food, the main ingredient, and a minor ingredient, then you make only one blessing, and that blessing is determined by the ikar, by the main ingredient. And that blessing that you make on the main ingredient exempts the lesser ingredient at the same time. So sounds easy enough, okay? So now let's say, but it's not nearly as easy as you'd think. So what if you have in front of you a plate, right? And on the plate you have a fillet of fish, right? And some green beans and some couscous, right? Do you apply the rule here, right? I'm giving this because it's kind of an obvious case. How many people think that you apply the rule and you decide what's the main ingredient on this plate and you only make one blessing and you pater the whole plate? Anyone want to say what they think? Anybody? Nobody wants to contribute. Nobody wants to go out on a limb here. Well, definitely here, no one holds that you only make a blessing on the main thing. And now, first of all, how would you even determine what the main thing is? How many people would vote for the fish being the main thing? I can't see everyone's hands.
Yes, the fish.
But I see, okay, so I see yours. So, yeah. So most people would probably say the fish is the main thing, because, you know, if your kid calls home and says, Mom, what are we having for dinner tonight? So probably say we're having fish, not that we're having green beans, right? But you can't make a blessing. But then if that's the case, the fish is the ikar, you'd make a shakol on the fish, and now you don't have to make a blessing on the couscous or the green beans. Does anyone here vote for the couscous being the main thing on the plate? Well, I don't know if I have any votes, but some might think, well, it's a mizona, right? So a mizona is the main thing. Now, let's say you don't like fish and you don't like couscous, but you're eating it because your mom says you got to eat it, right? But you really love green beans. I don't know how many kids there are out there like that. So for you, maybe green beans are the main thing on the thing, but none of that matters. Why doesn't it matter? Because even though all these food items are on the same plate, we don't apply the rule of ikar and tafel here. And this is the crucial first question, because these are three different foods. These are three different dishes, right? There's green beans, there's couscous, there's a main dish, and there's side dishes. Nobody would claim that all these three, that these three are mixed together as one food, right? And that's the crucial, the first thing that you need to know. Is this one food or two foods? In this particular case, if it was no one would argue that these are one food. There's the three different dishes. There's, you know, like if you go to a restaurant, you'd order fish, and then they would give you choices which side dishes to order. They might go along with the fish. They might taste good with, but they're not the same. Okay, so that's thing number one. So you have to keep that in mind. In order to apply the rule of ikar and tafel, it has to be one food. Okay, that sounds simple enough when you're dealing with a plate. But what if you have a food, right, that you only eat it because you because you want to make another food taste good, right? So for example, let's say you go to the to a restaurant and you order French fries, right? So the bracha on French fries are ha'adama, right? They're sliced potato. However, you love French fries with ketchup. Now, ketchup, even though it has some tomato in there somewhere, I think, but it's a shehakol. If someone were to actually sit down and eat ketchup plain, it would be a shehakol, right? But in this particular case, this would be a case where you would apply the rule, even though they might look separate. But when you want when the child or any person orders French fries, you don't order French fries and ketchup and then mix them. You order French fries, right? And then you dip it in the ketchup because you like the way it tastes with ketchup, right? So there's a case of one food. And I don't think I need to, by show of hands, I think most people would agree that here you have an ikar and a tafel, the ikar being the French fries and the tafel being the ketchup. But so far it's easy. Let's say you like dipping your crackers in hummus, right? So how many people think that the crackers are the ikar, are the main one? Now, here it's not so simple, right? Hummus it's a protein, right? A lot of people really like the hummus, and they're using the crackers simply as a means of they need something to dip into the hummus, so they like hummus with a little crunch. So over here, determining what is the ikar and what is the tafel is gonna be a little more difficult. As we go through, I'm gonna come back to the crackers and hummus question, and we'll try to resolve it. But I think you can understand already why this is starting to get a little shaky here, right? As what's the ikar and what's the tafel.
So
yes, go ahead.
Another question. Let's say you, going back to the fish, let's say you have fish, and let's say you grind up your own fresh breadcrumbs out of bread, and you dip the fish in the bread.
Right.
Crumbs.
Right. That's a very good question. So very good question. I am going to get to that specific example, but I'm assuming you fried the fish in your breadcrumbs. Is that how you baked it in the breadcrumbs or whatever?
Yeah,
is that right?
Fresh homemade breadcrumbs, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So the fresh homemade part is good because it adds a little more chashivos to the breadcrumbs, right? It adds a little more specialty to them. However, when you eat that fish, is that one dish or two? Is that one food or two? Is that fish? It's one, right? Most of us would agree that if someone would ask you, what are you eating? You'll say, I'm eating fish. You're not going to say, I'm eating fish and I'm eating breadcrumbs, right? You say, I'm eating fish. What did you do to the fish? You put breadcrumbs on it. So in that case, almost everyone would agree that you look at the ikar, and since the ikar is fish, you make one blessing on the fish. So that would be true if you take fried chicken and you fry it and you have a breadcrumbs or some other kind of topping. The main thing there is the chicken, right? Or the meat, or if you take nuts and you fry them with a coating of dough. Sometimes people do that with like a sweet dough. That would also be the main thing is the nut, right? So, but I'm glad you asked that question. That's a really good example of where you have, and similar to the French fries and the ketchup question, but not quite similar to the hummus, or the tacos and salsa question, right? What's the main thing? The tacos and salsa. Luckily, they may have the same blessing depending on which kind of taco it is, right? But the taco and salsa question, I would venture to say there's definitely people out there that really want to eat the salsa, right? And the tacos are just, they sell tacos as sometimes scoop shaped because basically they're just an excuse, something crunchy to put salsa in. I'm gonna get back to that, but the fish question was a really good one, and the answer is that since it's one dish, and since everyone would agree that the ikar is the fish, you make the blessing on the fish alone, which leads us to another thing. In the event that you could find a dip that people truly want to eat alone, I personally love like hummus that's made the way hummus is supposed to be made, right? So when you go to Israel and you go to a place that makes good fresh hummus the way it's supposed to be done, like there's nothing like it. It's one of the most delicious foods, at least in my humble opinion. So I truly go for the hummus, right? The cracker to me is just, I need something to dip in the hummus. You're not going to take a spoonful of hummus, but so for me, I would say in that particular case, and this is really something that you need to decide on your own. When you're eating this dish, what is for you the main thing? And it might not be so easy to figure out. So anything, even a piece of bread, can be a tafel, right? We're going to get to the fact that usually a mizonot or a hamotzi act as an ikar. When in doubt, you lean towards the mizonot, but it's not always the case. When you're not in doubt and you're 100% certain that the bread of the mizonot is absolutely a tafel. So the example given in halacha is often when you eat food that's very spicy and you take a piece of bread to the Gemara, the Chazal talk about lahafig ta'aman, to soften the taste, the hot taste of the burning food. People eat a piece of bread afterwards. There's no question the bread becomes a tafel, and you do not make a bracha on the bread, even though it's bread, right? Because it's an absolute tafel. And the case of the breadcrumbs on the fish, also everyone would agree that it's a tafel to the fish. Now, there are other cases we're about to get to, which are a doubt, and a mizonot makes it a little bit more chashuv, but we'll get there. So now let's say you take foods, something more like a salad or a stew, right? So until now, we were dealing with foods that were either totally separate or foods that you're dipping one into another, right? Now let's try to mix it up, literally mix it up, pun much intended, and see how complicated this can get. So let's say a typical salad these days often will have not just, give me 1 second, will not just have fruits or vegetables. It'll have a little bit of everything. You can have some vegetables in there. People might throw nuts and olives in there so that it's a ha'etz to the vegetables. Yeah, you may throw you may even throw mizonos, things like mizonos croutons, or even bread croutons. There could be all kinds of things mixed in there. So again, I'm going to go through a few examples to help us come to some determination. So now, let's say I give you rice. Now, when you go eat rice, I'm sure we've all had rice in all kinds of permutations, right? Rice with little bits of onion in it, rice with little bits of egg in it, rice with little bits of meat in it, especially Chinese rice, all kinds of stuff mixed in there. Now, if I ask you, what are you eating as you're taking a spoonful or a forkful of this rice, and your answer is, I'm eating rice, and you call it Chinese rice, fried rice, I don't know, name your whatever kind of rice it is, then you've just determined what the ikar is. The ikar is the rice, because you're eating a dish of rice. So this would go with this would answer the question for many dishes that we have. Like you might have, say, green beans with almonds, or people have like put nuts sometimes on green beans to make whatever, give it a nice crunch. So there, if I ask you, what are you eating? I'm eating green beans, right? So there you have the green beans are the ikar, even though the almonds are ha'etz, the green beans are hadam, right? So if the answer to the question, what are you eating, has a very clear, defined answer, then the proper blessing is on that answer, right? So I hope that makes sense, right? If I ask you if you have pasta mixed with all kinds of vegetables and fish, and I ask you, what are you eating? And you tell me I'm eating pasta, right? Well, that's a mizono, because you're eating pasta. Not even though it might have salmon mixed in or certain vegetables mixed in, depending on what pasta dish you're having. Now, so I was looking up, I remembered having a soup that had, like, I thought the most bracha that I had, and it was by a relative of mine that is Persian, and I put it in my note, E3, where there was green leafy stuff in there. There was noodles in there, there was meat in there, and there was beans in there, right? It was a very good soup. It's also nice and spicy. But this one really threw me for a loop in terms of what bracha you're supposed to make on it, right? Because what's the main thing? Like, what am I having? So if the soup had a name, like, for example, let's say they told me this is Persian bean soup, right? And there happens to be other stuff in there, like there happens to be greens and noodle. So, well, it's a bean soup. Oh, you just answered my question. A bean soup, I make ha'adama on, right? If they told me this is a Persian spinach soup or leaf soup, okay, it's greens, it's ha'adama, right? If it's a noodle soup and they happen to put vegetables in there, well, there you go. It's a mizonot. It's a noodle soup, right? But this is not what it has. Its own name. It's some Persian name, mashrashta soup, Well, I know I'm pronouncing it wrong, so forgive me if you're Persian, I'm completely pronouncing it wrong. So if that's the case, then what blessing do you make on it? So here some poskim say that when you're completely baffled, you have several options, right? Well, actually, before I say what some poskim say, when you're completely baffled, you have several options. One is you can take a piece out of the soup, take a noodle out, make a mizono, take a bean out and make a hadama, take a piece of meat out and make a shakol, and then you're good to go. Eat the soup. That's one approach. Another approach is to get a piece of bread, wash, and make hamotzi, and then you don't have to worry. But let's say you're a little bit more gutsy than that, and you don't want to try your cheap way out, and you really want to know what is the proper blessing on this soup. So some say you can use the principle of rove. Look at the soup and decide what's most in there, right? Is it mostly beans? Is it mostly meat? Okay, that is one way of applying it. Another way is if it's most, other poskim say, because there's a mizonot in there, the mizonot, and it's one of the significant, like, remember, we said a mizonot could be a tuffle, it could be a lesser important thing, but if it's in doubt, in other words, it's one of many ingredients, mizonot overpowers the rest of them. So therefore, you would make a mizonot on this soup, right? Okay, so those are ways to look at this, and we're gonna play around with examples soon as to like try to think of different dishes that we have to try to figure out what kind of blessing to make, what's considered the ikar, what's considered the tafel. In a case where a mizonot is being used simply as for another purpose, then it can never be considered its own ingredient. So a famous example of that is when you make a latke on Hanukkah, or you make a potato kugel. A lot of people will mix some kind of flour in there, or they might mix breadcrumbs, or they might mix matzah meal in there as an agent to help hold it together so it doesn't fall apart. If the purpose of the mizono is simply to accomplish that kind of goal, and it's not meant really to be as one of the ingredients as far as eating is concerned, then you definitely do not make a mizonot on that item, no matter how much mizonot you throw in there. Because if you ask somebody what they're eating a potato kugel, not a matzah meal kugel, right? So you'd make the blessing based on the potato. The same thing as the eggs that you throw in there. The purpose of the eggs is to hold it together. It's not considered a separate ingredient. It's all bottled to the potato. I mentioned in E6 the question that you brought up earlier about fried fish with breadcrumbs. So I'm not going to go into that again. So now let's go into some other cases. What if you have any number? There must be a myriad of dishes in Jewish cuisine, and probably I think all world cuisines have some variation of taking some kind of a filling, putting it in some kind of a dough, and either baking it or frying it, right? The blintzes, crepes, kreplach, deli rolls, knishes, I don't know. There's a million dishes like this. You can probably think of 100 examples. So when you look at it, right, does it answer when you ask the first primary question, is it one food or two? So most of us would agree that it's one food. I use the example of pizza too, because pizza has the same rule, even though it's not necessarily rolled up, unless it's like a calzone, right? But it's the same idea. You look at it, it's a piece of pizza, right? Even though the cheese is an important ingredient, and so it's one food. So if it's one food, and one of the and here you end up applying the mizonot rule. Both the dough and the filling are considered important ingredients, right? So again, you don't know which one beats out the other one, which one is the ikar, which one is a tuffle. If I ask you what you're eating, you'll say I'm eating a blintza. Now you might go and say I'm eating a cheese blintza, but you're still eating one item, which is a cheese blintza or a strawberry blintza or whatever it is, right? So the general halacha in these cases is that you make a mizonot because you have one food and you have a mizonot versus a non-mizonot, so you make the mizonot. And the same thing would be with pizza, other than the times that you might make a hamotzi on pizza, but we discussed that last time when we discussed the laws of the blessings on mizonot. So now I'm going to go back to the crackers. And then we're going to I'm going to go through my algorithm to try to put this all together in a sensible place. So one of my personal favorite foods is on Shabbos morning, a cracker with a piece of herring on it. So based on what we said until now, what do you all think you're supposed to do with the cracker with a piece of herring on it? How many people say that's one food?
The cracker, you say the blessing on the herring, I would think, and the cracker could be indistinguishable from.
Yeah, that some people will say that, right? Some people will say that the purpose of the crackers is really just to hold the herring, right? And if that's you, and you truly only you need something to put your herring on, then yeah, it's nice to have a little crunch, but then you would make a bracha on the herring alone. Now, the European poskim, the Mishnah Berurah, primary among them, used to say that no, you make two blessings on the cracker and on the herring, because he said he considered it two foods, and the cracker has importance to it as well. So the cracker is important, plus the herring is important. So what you really I have to think a bit of it on your own. The general practice in most cases is like the Mishnah Berurah, that you do make a mizonot on the cracker, and then you make a shehakol on the herring. But if you truly, truly know that you yourself really, really don't care that much about the cracker, and it's simply a means for holding the herring, then I agree. Then you'd be right. Then you would make only a blessing on the herring. So one thing I want to say before I go to the algorithm, and then we'll have covered this subject. So if you have a case, let's say you ate foods as two separate foods, right? So then, and one of them was mizonot, like let's say you made a blessing on the crackers and on the herring, then you do the same thing for the bracha achrona. You make an alamichya on the crackers, and you make a bor nefashot on the herring. If it had the law of one food, like you had a blinza or a knish, and you only made a mizonot, then you just make a alamichya. You do not make a bor nefashot on the filling of the knish or the blinza and so on. So now, if you look at my letter G on my notes, I might need to work this out a little more, but I think it's pretty good, right? And this was my algorithm, which kind of sums up what to do when you have mixed foods. So the first question you need to ask, right, is this one food or two? Does anybody want to throw out an example of a mishkabobble of food so we can try to apply my my algorithm? Somebody think about something you ate in the last day or two that was a mix of different foods.
Bibimbap.
Bibimbap. Okay, now you're gonna have to tell me what the ingredients of that are.
Well, any kind of vegetable you want to put on it.
Okay.
And maybe an egg, a fried egg, and
Okay.
rice.
And rice?
Mhm.
Okay, that's great. That's a great example, because you got three different things and three different brachot, right? The egg is shehakol, the rice is mizonot, and the vegetables are hadama, right?
Yeah.
And it has a name. I don't know what bibimbap means. It's in Korean, but
It means
it's
all mixed up.
perfect. That's perfect. So
They
it
always
means,
tell you to mix it all up.
so it means probably it's the same as the Yiddish cholent, basically. It's
Yeah.
a cholent. It's a mix, right? So so it doesn't. They don't call it rice and happen to put vegetables and egg in there. They don't call it eggs and happen to put rice. They call it by name. So first of all, is it one food or two? So if it's two foods, you say two blessings. We made that rule. If it's one food, go to step two, right? So in your case, the bibimbap, I think we'd all agree it's one food.
Actually, I think the bop word is cooked rice. I'm sorry.
All right, well,
Yeah.
I'm going to make an assumption that may become, well, just for the sake of argument, we'll pretend that we don't speak Korean and bibimbap is just a name. But even though it may be actually incorrect. So if it's a mix, so now let's look at the ingredients. Is one of these ingredients mizono? In this case, the bibimbap, there is one of them is rice, it's mizono, right?
Yeah.
So the blessing should be mizono, and I think that would be the halacha on bibimbap, right? Because especially since you said that it's actually means rice, so it's actually a rice dish. So then even if there's lots of other stuff, but if the basis is rice, that's the blessing.
Yeah, it's kind of like, in Chinese, the fried rice with all the stuff in it.
Yeah. Okay, but now let's say the purpose of the rice in there was simply to enhance the other ingredients, which is not the case in this case, but that would be the case in the breadcrumbs on the schnitzel case, right? So then the blessing would be on the other ingredient, the ha'adama or the shehakol. Now in this case, we still wouldn't have answered our question, even if the rice was there only for the other stuff. We're still left asking our question whether the egg or the vegetables are the ikar. So if there is no mizonot in the mixture, let's say you had a mixture of no mizonot. Let's say you had a Pesach cholent and you just, well, I don't know, that's a hard example, but you had a dish with a mix of vegetables cooked together and maybe some ha'etz and something else, but no mizonot. Now we have to go to the next step. So first, again, what is this called, right? Do we call this green beans, like my green beans and almonds example? Do we call it a cabbage salad or a fruit salad or a tuna salad, right? Even if it has tuna with various vegetables in there, then the bracha would be a shehakol on the tuna salad or ha'etz on the fruit salad, even if there are other brachot in there, and even if the other ones are not rove, even if there's more of the other stuff than the tuna. But if when you serve it, you say, here's some tuna salad, then it remains a tuna salad, and the bracha is the bracha on the tuna, right? But what if the name of the dish does not identify the primary ingredient, like we thought bibimbap, right? Then you need to look at it on your own and look at the dish yourself. What is the main dish to you? So if there's an obvious answer, I'm eating this because I like green beans, right? So then to you, the ikar is the green beans. Now, let's say if you don't have any primary preference for A over B, then you can look at the rove and say, what is the primary, which one is most? Is it mostly green beans? Is it mostly almonds? Now, if you can't figure out what the rove is, then you better figure out what the main thing is to you. And I put a whole bunch of examples in H, which can throw you off for a loop. We don't have that much time to talk about them. But what do you guys think about H5, matzo ball soup?
Well, the matzo ball has to be the.
All right. Well, first of all, apply question number 1 from my algorithm. All right. The first question is this one food or two foods?
It's the matzah and the soup. It's two foods.
So you say it's two foods. What does everyone else think? Anyone want to venture a guess as to what they think?
I'll take the opposite side. It's
Okay.
one food because it's soup.
Okay, and you're gonna call it okay, soup. But so now so according to those that chose that it's two foods, then what would the blessing be? Two blessings, right? A shehakol on the soup and a mizonot on the matzah ball.
Mhm.
If you hold it's one, which blessing are you going to make? The shehakol or the mizonot?
Shehakol.
Oh, no.
What do you think? Or what is that? Someone else? You think shehakol because you said it's a soup, right?
'Cause it's
I can
soup.
understand there's a reasoning behind that. And what does someone else disagree with her? It's a matzo ball soup. I'll disagree, right? So the main thing is the matzo ball. Everyone wants them. So it may depend. It may depend on the person, you know. Some people go because they want a matzo ball and the soup is just an afterthought. Most poskim say in that case that they hold like that it's considered two foods. Because people like soup and people like matzo balls. So, so it's two foods and you make two blessings. That's what most poskim would say in practical halacha today. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Like if you're sitting down and you know for sure, you know, you like eating matzo balls. The fact is, whenever you go to some restaurant or your friend's house or in your own kitchen and you take out some matzo balls, usually it's mixed in with some soup, but you're eating matzo balls. So in that case, you just make a mizonot, and if you happen to get some soup on your spoon, so be it. It's a tuffle, right? Right?
So we shouldn't spend all that time making that fresh chicken soup. Okay.
Well, if that's your thing, right? I mean, but if you like soup, and then whenever you go to someone else, they always throw in that matzo ball too. And you're really not interested in the matzo ball. You're just eating it because, I don't know, it's kind of interesting in the soup. Then the main thing for you is soup. But for most people, it's both, and it's two separate foods. But it doesn't have to be that way.
I think
So
there's a really practical discussion. We studied this before with Chaim Fruchter.
Yeah.
At some point, the discussion becomes about intention and being mindful of your intentions, and the sitting down to the matzo ball soup and discussing with yourself a little bit what am I really wanting to enjoy here is a good exercise of examining your intentions in other areas that are. I'm not saying eating is not critical.
Right.
But in different, more really difficult situations, being able to call up the muscle memory of examining your intentions.
Yeah, I agree. It's a good point. Yeah, it makes you think about, what I'm doing and why. And really that's the and it does depend. It's not the same dish may not have the same bracha for every person. A different context, it may have a different blessing. So the other examples, you're welcome to look through them. If anyone has any comments afterwards, we'll continue next time with some basic rules of brachot. We're getting closer and closer to the end of the laws of brachot. I'm going to try to cruise through them in another maybe 2 weeks, finish brachot, and then maybe we'll have some time to do the laws of Hanukkah before Hanukkah rolls around. Although it's coming pretty fast, but we'll try. Any other comments before we close up for today?
Nice to see you.
Thank you. It's nice to be here again. I know it's been a long break. Wednesday nights have been shot for the last month, but but thank you everyone for showing up, and Mirza Hashem next week we'll continue. All right. See you. Be well.
Thank you.
Right.